June 1944. The island of Saipan was burning. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and coral dust. American Marines moved cautiously through a landscape that looked more like the moon than the Pacific. Shattered palm trees, collapsed caves, bodies half buried in the sand. The battle had ended hours ago, but the silence was uneasy. Somewhere in the rubble, faint cries echoed. Medics followed the sound. Beneath a mound of rock and twisted metal, they found them. Japanese soldiers and civilians, wounded, shaking, some clutching grenades with trembling hands. They had been told Americans would torture them, that capture meant dishonor worse than death. But instead of rifles, the Americans carried morphine, bandages, and stretchers. One Marine knelt, pressing a hand to a man's chest. The Japanese soldier froze, then began to weep. His body shook, his breath breaking through the pain. Others, too weak to move, whispered, "Yamete, please." The doctors did not answer. They just worked, cutting open blood-soaked uniforms, stitching wounds, whispering calm English words that none of the prisoners understood. By the time the sun sank over the Pacific, men who had sworn to die for the emperor were alive, because their enemies refused to let them die. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had reached its most violent phase. Every mile of ocean, every scrap of volcanic rock, was contested with a ferocity the world had rarely seen. Japan's empire, once stretching from Burma to the Solomons, was collapsing under relentless American pressure. But its soldiers did not retreat. They fought to the last breath, following an uncompromising creed that rejected surrender as the ultimate shame. This was not simply military doctrine, it was spiritual conviction. From the earliest days of their training, Japanese troops were told that capture was worse than death, that those who surrendered would lose their souls and bring disgrace upon their families. The Imperial Army distributed pamphlets describing Americans as monsters, men who mutilated bodies, desecrated women, and burned prisoners alive. So when battles like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu erupted, surrender was almost unthinkable. Soldiers blew themselves up with grenades, civilians jumped from cliffs, and mothers drowned their own children rather than be taken alive. To the American forces advancing through the islands, it seemed like madness. Again and again, medics found wounded Japanese soldiers who refused treatment. Some even pulled pins on grenades as doctors approached. Others, barely conscious, tried to crawl away from rescue. This was the mindset the U.S. faced, an enemy who saw mercy as deceit and captivity as a fate worse than annihilation. But on the American side, another code ruled, one born not of fanaticism, but of duty and conscience. The U.S. Army Medical Corps, Navy hospital units, and Marine field medics operated under the Geneva Convention of 1929, which the United States had ratified and Japan had not. To these American medics, a wounded man was a patient, not an enemy. Whether he wore khaki, olive drab, or the rising sun, their obligation was the same: to preserve life. Still, reality often defied ideals. On battlefields like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, the intensity of combat left little room for compassion. Medics were shot while carrying stretchers. Corpsmen were executed after being captured. The Japanese often targeted the Red Cross armband itself, believing it a symbol of deceit. In response, many American units became hardened. The war taught them that hesitation meant death. Yet, amid that firestorm, there were moments when humanity re-emerged, even against all logic. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. invasion of Saipan would test that humanity to its limit. This 15-mile-long island was home to 30,000 Japanese civilians and more than 20,000 soldiers. The Japanese High Command had declared Saipan vital to the defense of the home islands, a place where the enemy must die to the last man. The Americans landed on June 15th, For 3 weeks, the island became a living inferno. Every hill and cave was fought for at bayonet range. Civilian shelters were bombed, hospitals burned, and bodies filled the ravines. When the final assault ended on July 9th, more than 40,000 Japanese lay dead. But for the first time in the Pacific Campaign, hundreds did not die. They surrendered. Some were wounded soldiers dragged out of bunkers. Others were civilians found hiding in the ruins. It was here, among the chaos of Saipan's shattered cliffs, that the extraordinary encounters between U.S. doctors and Japanese prisoners began. Moments that defied years of hatred and challenged the very logic of war itself. The U.S. medical system in the Pacific was one of the most complex and disciplined humanitarian networks ever built under fire. Behind every beach landing stood a chain of care. Medics on the line, corpsmen in the surf, battalion aid stations behind the dunes, field hospitals hidden under camouflage nets, and hospital ships waiting just beyond the horizon. A wounded Marine could go from a foxhole to an operating table in less than an hour. It was a system designed for survival, fast, efficient, and relentless. But what made it remarkable was that it didn't stop at the edge of nationality. Once a Japanese soldier was disarmed and stabilized, he became a patient under American protection. The Geneva Convention demanded it. American military ethics reinforced it. Field manuals instructed medical staff to render first aid to all wounded, friend or foe, without distinction. Even on islands where surrender was considered impossible, medics carried Japanese phrase cards that read, "Don't be afraid, we will help you." Still, it was never easy. Language barriers turned every operation into an exercise in guesswork. The Japanese feared injections, thinking they were poison. Some slashed their throats with hidden blades as doctors approached. Others had to be restrained, whispering prayers to the emperor as morphine dulled their pain. And yet, the medics persisted. Reports from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions on Saipan describe entire aid tents filled with wounded Japanese, men who had once sworn never to be taken alive. Some were missing limbs, others blinded by shrapnel. American nurses cleaned their wounds with the same hands that had just treated U.S. Marines minutes earlier. Many of the medical staff had personal reasons to hate the enemy. They had seen comrades mutilated or executed after capture. Some had lost brothers in Pearl Harbor or on Bataan. And still, when the stretcher arrived, their duty overrode emotion. The medics followed procedure: identify, stabilize, operate. Captain Benjamin Salomon, an Army dentist serving as a field surgeon, wrote before his death on Saipan, "If a man can be saved, it must be tried." He died defending his patients during a Japanese assault on his aid station, machine gun in hand. But his philosophy lived on in every medic who refused to let hatred dictate care. By the late stages of the Pacific War, the U.S. Medical Corps had treated thousands of Japanese prisoners. On Guam, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the same pattern repeated. Soldiers who had expected execution instead found clean bandages and food. Some wept openly, not from pain, but from disbelief. American doctors later recalled that treating Japanese POWs was a psychological battle as much as a medical one. The goal was not just to heal bodies, but to prove that civilization had not completely collapsed in the furnace of total war. For the Japanese prisoners, those moments often marked the first time they questioned the propaganda they'd been fed, and the first time they saw mercy as strength, not weakness. In Saipan's ravaged hospitals and tents, that moral shock became the quiet beginning of a transformation, one that would ripple far beyond the island and shape post-war understanding between two nations that had once sworn never to forgive each other. The human angle of Saipan's mercy story begins with fear. Raw, ancestral fear. To the Japanese soldiers, the Americans were not men but phantoms of vengeance. Every military bulletin from Tokyo had warned them. The U.S. tortured captives, violated women, and desecrated the dead. The emperor's soldiers were told to expect no mercy and to take none. So when the Americans entered the caves and hospitals of Saipan, those who had survived the bombing trembled in silence. Some hid grenades under their bandages. Others clenched their teeth so tightly they bled. They waited for cruelty that never came. Instead, they saw men kneel beside them, enemies who handled their wounds with care, who spoke softly even when not understood. The first reaction was disbelief, then tears, then silence again, heavier than before. One Navy medic later described it simply, "They thought we were going to finish them. We gave them water instead." The medical angle reveals another kind of heroism, quiet, procedural, yet no less profound. Battlefield triage in the Pacific was brutal mathematics. Every minute counted. Medics had to decide who lived and who died. Yet on Saipan, even when the tents overflowed with wounded Americans, the surgeons refused to ignore the Japanese prisoners. Dr. Norman T. Kirk, Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, had issued standing orders. Enemy casualties would receive the same standard of treatment as friendly forces. In practice, this meant valuable supplies, morphine, sulfa drugs, plasma, were spent on men who had been firing at Americans just hours before. Corpsmen recalled cutting off ragged uniforms adorned with the red sun while their own Marines groaned nearby. It was an impossible moral balance, but for the doctors, it was never about favoritism. It was about principle. War had stripped away every comfort, every illusion of nobility. What remained was the single thread that separated barbarism from humanity: mercy. And for many medics, that thread became sacred. When a wounded Japanese soldier began to scream as ether took hold, an American nurse instinctively took his hand. She later wrote, "He was so young, I don't know his name, but in that moment, he wasn't my enemy. He was just someone's son." This was the quiet rebellion of the Pacific medics, the refusal to become what war demanded. They worked under fire, surrounded by hatred, but their compassion became an act of defiance. And through that defiance, something extraordinary began to happen. The prisoners who had feared dishonor began to see humanity in those they once called devils. Some even tried to whisper thanks, their words broken, their eyes wide with confusion. In those dimly lit tents of Saipan, surrounded by the scent of iodine and smoke, mercy became contagious. From the Japanese command's perspective, what happened on Saipan was unthinkable. For years, Tokyo's officers had built an empire on the doctrine of gyokusai, the honorable death, the belief that dying for the emperor was the only path to virtue. To surrender was to erase one's family name from history. The propaganda machine in Japan had painted American soldiers as savages who would torture or kill captives without hesitation. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, even children's textbooks reinforced that myth. It was a psychological weapon meant to harden resolve and prevent mass surrenders. But when word reached Tokyo that prisoners on Saipan were being treated by American doctors, disbelief turned to panic. It threatened to unravel the very foundation of Japan's war ideology. For the U.S. leadership, however, this paradox became a moral opportunity. Commanders like Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Holland Smith emphasized the need to treat prisoners humanely, not just out of duty, but as a statement of civilization. Every act of mercy was a weapon against the enemy's lies. Reports were filed through military intelligence units documenting the psychological impact of compassion. Some captured Japanese soldiers admitted their training had been false. They wrote in their testimonies that they had expected torture, but instead received food and medicine. One prisoner described his first bowl of rice in an American hospital as the moment I realized I had been deceived. This was a revelation that reached beyond strategy. It was about perception. In the eyes of the world, the Pacific War was not only a contest of armies, but of values. Where Japan glorified death, America chose life. Where one side celebrated sacrifice, the other insisted on saving even the enemy. And yet, these choices came with weight. Many American soldiers who lost friends in battle struggled to accept that their medics were saving the same men who had killed them. Some protested, others refused to help. But the doctors stood firm. "If we lose compassion," one surgeon said, "we lose the reason we fight." That conviction transformed Saipan's field hospitals into something more than just tents of healing. They became moral battlegrounds. Every injection, every bandage wrapped around an enemy wound was a quiet rejection of hate. By the end of the campaign, hundreds of Japanese prisoners owed their lives to those doctors, and though they could not yet comprehend it, those small acts of mercy would echo through the decades that followed, laying the fragile groundwork for reconciliation after the war. It happened on the northern cliffs of Saipan, a place the Marines called Suicide Point. The battle had ended, but the horror had not. Below the jagged coral ledges, hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers lay wounded among the rocks, waves crashing against the shore below. Many had thrown themselves from the cliffs, believing capture meant torture. Some survived the fall, broken, bleeding, half-drowned. They waited for death. When American search teams arrived, what they found was beyond comprehension. Women clutching children, soldiers missing limbs, the smell of salt and decay mixing with the smoke of battle. The Japanese were terrified. Some screamed as the Marines approached. Others tried to crawl toward the sea to drown themselves. Then the medics came. Navy corpsmen from the 4th Marine Division waded through waist-deep surf, carrying stretchers. They had orders to recover the wounded. All wounded. Every step was a risk. Snipers still watched from the cliffs above, but they kept going. One medic, pharmacist's mate First Class Thomas C. Overstreet, later recalled the scene. "They thought we were going to kill them. When we gave them water, they began to cry. One man bowed his head and wouldn't look up. I realized he was ashamed to still be alive. The Americans treated shattered bones, burns, and deep shrapnel wounds right there on the rocks." A Japanese soldier, no older than 20, gripped a Marine's hand as a needle slid into his arm. Tears streamed down his face. He whispered something the interpreter later translated as, "Why?" The answer came not in words, but in silence. In the calm rhythm of medical tools clinking against metal trays, in the steady heartbeat of a doctor saving an enemy life. Further inland, at an improvised aid station near Tanapag, another group of medics worked around the clock. Among them was Navy Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Ralph T. Hesselbrock, who described performing amputations on both American and Japanese casualties under the same tent. He wrote in his report, "We had no distinction. They were all human." Some Japanese patients, upon awakening, looked confused to still be alive. Several began to weep when they saw Americans tending to them. One particularly haunting incident involved a Japanese nurse found wounded in a cave. Expecting execution, she tried to take her own life with a hidden blade, but was stopped by a corpsman. When she awoke later to find her wounds bandaged and her life spared, she broke down in uncontrollable sobs. The interpreter noted that she repeated one phrase over and over. "America no Isha, yasashi." The American doctor is kind. For the medics, it was not a moment of triumph, but of quiet exhaustion. They were covered in sand, blood, and seawater, their faces lined with fatigue. Yet something had shifted in that brutal place. The line between enemy and patient had dissolved. By sunset, the cliffs were dotted with stretchers being carried toward the beach. Japanese, American, civilian, all moved together under the same setting sun. It was the most unlikely scene in a war defined by hatred. Mercy blooming in the shadow of annihilation. In the days that followed, The field hospitals on Saipan became sanctuaries of contradiction, a place where enemies lay side by side, breathing the same air, bound by the same pain. For the first time, Japanese prisoners could see the Americans up close, not as faceless demons from propaganda posters, but as tired, compassionate men with sunburned faces and trembling hands. The U.S. Navy's hospital ship Solace received more than 150 Japanese wounded in the week after Saipan fell. One nurse remembered how the prisoners refused to eat at first, certain the food was poisoned. When the Americans tasted it in front of them, the fear began to fade. Soon after, the weeping began. The interpreters noted that many of the prisoners apologized, not in defiance, but in shame. One officer, his arm gone from a shell burst, whispered through tears, "I told my men Americans were beasts, but beasts do not feed their enemies." For the medics, these reactions were not moments of pride, but of reckoning. They were haunted by what they saw, by the realization that mercy, simple and unspoken, could destroy years of hate faster than any bomb. A Navy surgeon later wrote in his log, "We saved men who tried to kill us, and somehow that made us remember who we were." Inside the tent wards, a strange stillness hung over the nights. The moans of pain were joined by murmured prayers, Japanese voices reciting sutras beside the quiet hum of American generators. The interpreters said the prisoners were praying not for victory or vengeance, but for their families, and, astonishingly, for the doctors who had spared them. When the time came for transfer to the POW camps, many could barely look the medics in the eye. They bowed deeply, some even saluting, their tears glistening under the lamplight. What began as an act of procedure had become an act of redemption, one that neither side fully understood. And though the war would continue to rage across the Pacific, the cliffs of Saipan had witnessed something almost unheard of, men finding fragments of humanity in the ruins of total war. The events on Saipan rippled through the Pacific far beyond the shattered cliffs and coral beaches. For the U.S. command, the survival of hundreds of Japanese prisoners was not just a logistical challenge. It was a revelation. For the first time, large groups of captured enemy soldiers were alive to talk, to describe their fears, and to expose the web of lies Tokyo had woven. Military intelligence officers quickly recognized the value of what mercy had achieved. Every rescued soldier, every treated civilian, became a living message that contradicted years of Japanese propaganda. Reports from the U.S. Office of War Information noted that humane treatment of enemy wounded has done more to weaken Japanese morale than any leaflet or broadcast. Prisoners, transferred from Saipan to Guam and Hawaii, brought with them stories of American doctors who had saved them. They spoke of clean water, bandages, rice, and medicine. One account, written down by interpreter Charles McCarthy, described a wounded Japanese sergeant who told new captives, "If you live, surrender. The Americans will not harm you. They are not the devils we were told." That single testimony spread quietly through the Japanese ranks like an infection of doubt. Interrogators began hearing whispers, men who had lost faith in their government's myth of glorious death. Some even surrendered rather than die uselessly. Though the effect was limited, the psychological tremor was undeniable. For the Americans, Saipan also marked a turning point in how they viewed the enemy. Before 1944, hatred ran deep. The surprise at Pearl Harbor, the atrocities in the Philippines, the savagery of Guadalcanal, all had hardened American hearts. But on Saipan, for the first time, many soldiers saw their enemy not as a faceless fanatic, but as a human being caught in the same machinery of war. Still, the contradiction was difficult to bear. In one Marine diary, a line summed up the confusion. "We killed them in the morning and saved them in the evening." I don't know which part was the war. The mercy shown on Saipan did not stop the bloodshed that followed. Battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa would prove even more merciless. But something invisible had shifted. A seed of empathy had been planted, small and fragile, among men trained to hate. That seed would grow slowly, and by the war's end, it would help shape the moral framework of how America handled its enemies, even in victory. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the echoes of Saipan reached across the Pacific, into the camps, into the hospitals, into the hearts of men who had once sworn never to live under an enemy's mercy. Thousands of Japanese prisoners of war were now under American custody, scattered across Guam, the Marianas, Hawaii, and eventually the mainland United States. Many of those first captives from Saipan were among them. Their memories of that battle, and the doctors who saved them, became stories told in whispers around the barracks. The U.S. Military Medical Corps continued to apply the same code. All men were to be treated humanely, with full medical care and proper food. By 1946, over 300,000 Japanese POWs had passed through American care. More than half of them treated for disease, wounds, or malnutrition. The Red Cross praised the U.S. for its adherence to international law, while reports from repatriated prisoners stunned post-war Japan. Some of those returning men wrote to their families about their disbelief. One survivor from Saipan told his village newspaper, "I learned the emperor's enemies had more compassion than our own leaders." Another wrote in a diary later found in Nagasaki, "The doctor who saved my leg wore no sword. He said nothing. I saw America's strength not in guns, but in his hands." These testimonies were not publicized widely in occupied Japan, but among those who heard them, they carried a quiet power. They softened the bitterness of defeat and began the slow process of humanizing the former enemy. For the Americans, these experiences shaped post-war military medicine and diplomacy. The lesson was clear. Mercy was not weakness, it was moral superiority. The same medics who had served in Saipan and Okinawa went on to train new generations of Corps men, embedding humanitarian conduct as a permanent doctrine in the U.S. Armed Forces. In later decades, when Japan and the United States became allies, historians looking back often pointed to those unlikely moments in 1944 when mercy broke through hatred as early seeds of reconciliation. The compassion shown on the cliffs of Saipan stood as proof that even in a war of annihilation, the smallest human gesture could outlive the roar of battle. On paper, Saipan was a victory measured in territory. In spirit, it was a victory measured in humanity. History often remembers the victors, the generals, the ships, the flags planted in the soil. But on Saipan, the true victory did not come from conquest. It came from a handful of medics kneeling in the sand, their hands trembling, their uniforms soaked in blood, saving lives that their own countrymen would have gladly taken. In the great machinery of World War II, mercy was an act of rebellion. Every bandage placed on a Japanese wound, every drop of plasma given to an enemy, was a defiance of the logic that had consumed both nations. For the Americans, it was a reminder that civilization must not collapse, even when surrounded by barbarity. For the Japanese, it was the first glimpse of a truth their leaders had hidden, that compassion was stronger than fear, and that surrender was not always dishonor. Many of the men who were treated on Saipan would never meet their doctors again. But some lived long enough to tell their children how their enemy's kindness had saved them. In that sense, the U.S. doctors and corpsmen who worked amid the ruins became unlikely architects of peace, men who rebuilt trust one heartbeat at a time. Their legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in the quiet code they upheld, that even in the darkest hours, humanity must remain indivisible. Because the moment mercy disappears, victory itself loses meaning. When the Pacific War finally ended and Japan lay in ashes, the image of those doctors, standing in the heat, tending to the broken, refusing to hate, stood as a small light in a sea of destruction. It was proof that decency had survived the fire. And long after the guns fell silent, that light continued to burn. A reminder that in war, the rarest courage is not the will to fight, but the strength to heal.